welcome to R.J. Julia Booksellers. Thank you very much for joining us. We are recording tonight, and we do have something special which we are doing this fall. It's so new that I have to read from the script. So this fall, we're distributing frequent flyer cards for our in-person events. Here's how it works. For each in-person event that you attend, by the end of the year, from now to the end of the year, you'll receive a stamp. So attending an event with a best-selling author is, of course, a reward in itself. But this fall, we're upping the game. Attend 5 events and you'll receive a $5 gift card and an R.J. Julia journal. Attend 10 events and you'll receive a $25 gift card and an R.J. Julia journal, plus a book lover sticker. This applies for in-person events, both here in the Madison store, and some of you have been over at the Middletown store as well. And all R.J. Julia hosted events that are off premises. So be sure to pick up one of these cards. If you've already got one, you can get your stamp up at the front. That's where we will be having the book signing as well. So that's for our frequent flyer. Now to the very exciting part. Here in the store, we do have this brand new book, Life on the Mississippi, and we will have the signing immediately following. Why not start with the big flash news that I just heard, which is, this is 4 weeks on the bestseller list, number 7 and climbing. And a little bit of an introduction. Rinker Buck began his career in journalism at the Berkshire Eagle and was a longtime staff writer, many of you know, for the Hartford Courant here in Connecticut. He has written for Vanity Fair, New York, Life, and many other publications, and his work has won the Penn New England Award, the Eugene S. Pulliam National Journalism Writing Award, and the Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award. He is the New York Times best-selling author, many you know, of The Oregon Trail, Flight of Passage, and First Job. He lives in Tennessee. Now, as I was preparing for tonight, I dove into this book, and I'm thinking, international trade. What? So the flatboat men, the original traders on the Mississippi, helped create the American economy. They were the backbone of the global economy, and I kept reading, And then I got to something else, and I said, there was so much that was new to me. I was a little bit relieved when, before I got to page 50, there was something about the author was startled by his research. And I thought, phew, at least I'm not the only one who was startled by this. According to the book, he had never heard of flatboats, the Great Migration down the rivers, store boats, and coffle lines, which were all things I needed to look up. I personally married into a trucking company in Buffalo, New York. So something that startled me a great deal was when I read, very early on in the book, that a typical 15-barge tow on the western rivers carries as much freight as 1,050 semi-trucks. I was astonished, so I just kept going and kept saying, as I went. Rinker has provided us many lessons to learn. In his words, flatboat was indeed an ideal school for acquiring knowledge of human nature. I have plenty more questions, I'm sure you do. Thankfully, we will have Q&A at the end of this session. So be sure your cell phones are silenced. Let's enjoy this discussion together. And please welcome Rinker Buck.
Thank you. That was one of the more thoughtful introductions I've received in a while, and it's also a pleasure. I've been on a national book tour. It's also a pleasure to be here. Usually it's Rinker Buck began his career at the Berkshire Eagle. So, and I'm doing, and I'm very glad to be here at R.J. Julia. Those of you who are neighbors and everything know what a distinguished store this is nationwide, and I feel like whenever I come here, I'm sort of rubbing on a favorable stone, and maybe my book will continue to do well. I'm on a different kind of tour this year. I'm doing the non-reading reading tour. Several years ago, my editor said to me, listen, when you go out and give these readings, don't just read from your book. Do not read from your book. Just stand up and talk and tell them about it, make them feel personable. And it sort of rang a bell because I'd been to many readings of authors I really liked. I'm not going to name them, and quite famous, write great books, and then they read from the books, and it seemed to verify what my editor was saying, which is, don't read from your book. Authors who read from your book are entirely boring. So what happened about a few months after that, I just happened to be up in Maine. I was living in Maine for a couple of years. It's a chapter in the book, taking care of my mother in her later years. And a very well-known female novelist who has a house nearby came to the Maine Coast Bookshop to present her latest book. But unfortunately, she was reading from her latest book, and it was a short story that she read from. And short stories tend to be about, people who have dog issues or, neurotic housewife, whatever it is. And so I'm sitting there, and I bought some books so we could take them up afterwards, have them signed for my mother and myself. The last thing I remember as I was sitting there listening to her read was, wow, my editor in New York is right. This really is boring. Listen to a writer reading from. And then there was some polite clapping and whatnot, and I went up with my books to have them signed, stood in line for a while. And I had really admired this author, really liked this author. I remember reading her when I was a youngster in New York City in my 20s. So I finally got to the end of the line, and I said, I'm so pleased to meet you. I've been reading your books for years, and this is really a pleasure. And she said, well, it's a pleasure to meet you too, now that you're awake. So I'm going to try not to do that to you. So what happened is, as many of you know, many years ago I took a covered wagon and a team of mules, a real actual 1880s covered wagon, and a team of mules across the Oregon Trail, and kind of discovered a writing form that allowed me to use, not a reenactor, but allowed me to use the actual mode of transport of the pioneers to see the country they went through and to turn it into kind of a social laboratory of pausing to reflect on the history, but also what had become of those people and their descendants in this country today. And one of the things that amazed me when I crossed the Oregon Trail, it took us 4 months to get from St. Joe, Missouri to Portland, Oregon. One of the things that amazed me on the trip was the number of major water courses, major rivers that these pioneers had to cross. The Platte, the Sweetwater, the Columbia, the Snake. These are very large rivers, and the pioneers went to extraordinary lengths to figure out ways to get their wagons and their teams across. And I couldn't figure out where they had these riverine skills. How were they able to do this? And the answer was provided when I reached a town along the Columbia River, just 300 or 400 miles from the end, right as the pioneers reached the Cascades, called the Dalles. And the Dalles is this lovely town along the Columbia River that sprang up as an Oregon Trail town because the pioneers' wagons were in such terrible shape when they got there, and they looked at the Cascades up ahead and they realized the shape this wagon is in, we may not get across the mountains. There's something called the Barlow Road that went out through there. And so the Dalles grew as a town, a very prosperous town now, as a place where the wagons were torn apart. A whole group of men came to do this. Torn apart, reconfigured, rebuilt into flatboats and rafts. And perhaps as many as 30 or 40% of the pioneers actually completed their journey to the top of the Willamette Valley where they were going to farm on the Columbia River in a flatboat. So I went over to the local history room, curious about this, and it's amazing what you can find in local history rooms if you're patient and you know what you're looking for. And I found 2 monographs, 2 really beautifully written memoirs, unpretentious, common man memoirs, by fellows who had worked as carpenters in the Dalles during this period, the 1850s, converting wagons to boats. And one sentence inspired my next book, which was this old fellow, Francis Everett, was talking about working as a carpenter on the river, and he said most of the pioneers were exceptionally adept at helping us carpenters turn the wagons into flatboats and then sailing them down the river, down the Columbia. There's some rapids that made it difficult because of their vast experience with river traffic during the great flatboat era of the 19th century. And my feeling was, I read more history than most people do, and I had never heard of the great flatboat era. So I started studying, and the topic appealed to me greatly because all the things about American history that were never officially taught to you, they weren't part of a college course that trickled down to a high school course, etc. All of those things I found over the years are more significant than the official history, which is often official myth that is taught in schools. And just think about some of the subjects yourself. You know, women not being given the vote, they took the vote. Civil rights, indigenous culture, etc., etc. Just think of all those things you know about where the history we should know, we have not been told. So I got busy, and while I was taking care of my mom, I had this beautiful little cabin along the Damariscotta River in Maine, and I filled it full of boxes with all the different subjects, monographs, scholarly articles, books, etc. And here's what I learned. Immediately after and even during the Revolution, there was something called the Great Migration across the Appalachian chain, particularly the Alleghenies around Pittsburgh, because the Continental soldiers, including my forebears, knew they were never going to get paid. It was absolutely, they just never had gotten paid, and they were promised at Valley Forge and Morristown encampment, you're going to get paid, you're going to get paid. And finally, and it was publicized at the time, the Second Continental Congress passed legislation giving every Revolutionary War veteran entitlement to a warrant. The warrant would be transferable to free land on the frontier in the Ohio River and Mississippi River Valley upon the commencement upon the end of the Revolutionary War. So they streamed across in great numbers, and the towns around Pittsburgh became boat building capitals because it was much more efficient to follow the Ohio. This red line here you see is the Ohio, which joins the Mississippi at Cairo, Illinois. 1,000 miles on the Ohio, 1,000 miles to New Orleans. In the meantime, New Orleans had become the fastest growing export city in the world. There were 2 kinds of traffic. The first traffic were pioneers, and they traveled in these very heavy arcs. And I'll explain what a flatboat is and why it works so well for America in a little bit when we get to the pictures. But the pioneers traveled down in these arcs, and it was a beautiful, crude vessel. But they had all their draft animals, their cows, their horses, chickens, everything. Maybe a family, maybe 2, on a 60-foot flatboat that was built that could carry tons and tons and tons of all their farm equipment and so forth, the old stone sinks and that kind of thing. They got down the river. Essentially, this was the group that settled Kentucky and Tennessee, southern Indiana, southern Ohio, and so forth. And they became the first pioneers 50 years before the 1850s period. when the pioneers were crossing the plains on wagons. But the second group, and even more significant, were the cargo haulers, the entrepreneurs, following the journey, the publicization of the journey of a fellow named Jacob Yoder, who in 1882 sailed, and he was a Revolutionary War veteran, very important guy actually, during the war. But before the war was even over, in 1782, he took a flatboat down all the way to New Orleans, built his own flatboat in Old Redstone Fort near Pittsburgh, along the Monongahela River, which merges into the Ohio.
Okay, thanks.
Long story short, he got to New Orleans, sold all his farm products from his Pennsylvania farm, grain, dried apples, salted pork, that sort of stuff, for warrants that he then, New Orleans was part of Spanish America at that point, for warrants which he then carried to Cuba and bought beaver pelts for, beaver pelts being very, very high demand product because of the beaver hat. Took those to Havana, bought beaver pelts, took the beaver pelts back to Baltimore, sailed to Baltimore, and made a profit of $4,000, which was an extraordinary amount of money for 4 months' work at the time. It was written up by a Baltimore paper. Everyone decided, wow, this is what we've got to do. The country was devastated, the economy was devastated. The Ohio River Valley was beginning to be settled. They were already producing surpluses, and they had to get that product down to New Orleans, from which it could be sailed overseas. Between 1802, some 200,000 tons of product was taken from Pittsburgh all the way to New Orleans and landed in New Orleans as an export. By the 1840s, it was 200 million tons a year being carried to New Orleans. During any one summer, during the freshet season from the spring and the early winter when the rivers were high, there were 10,000 flatboats in this area. This is what, coming down in one way or another. Only about 5,000 or 6,000 on these two rivers themselves, but another 5,000 or 6,000 on the Wabash and the Kanawha and all the other rivers, carrying it down to where a bigger boat would carry it to New Orleans. This created the American economy. This is how America became akin to China today, this extraordinary and surprising growth country that defied all expectations. By the 1870s, because of this, America had exceeded the economies. The export economy of America had exceeded Great Britain and France combined. It was an amazing story, and I realized, wow, this is the frontier. This happened 50 years before this happened. This is the real frontier, and all the memes, all the cultural habits, all the business skills, et cetera, and particularly the water skills, were developed here along the real frontier. By comparison, between the Revolution and the American Civil War, 3 million Americans traveled this space. In the 1850s, 1843 to the Civil War, 400,000 Americans traveled by planes, by the dusty covered wagons. Why the myth of the Western frontier and covered wagons and cowboys and Indians and all that, why that myth took over and became the dominant intellectual motif of the average American about what our frontier was, is a long and complicated subject, and I write a little bit about that in the book. And why this was neglected, I don't really know, but once you transfer your mind from a plains mentality, which was really afterward and very relatively small group, to a riverine conception of our economy and how it grew, all sorts of things start to come into shape as if you just discovered the Rosetta Stone. For instance, it's amazing when you look at how unstable and how turbulent America was. We had not only politically, socially, but we had major depressions, much larger than the Great Depression of the 1930s. In 1837, the Panic of 1837, 1853, 1873, and again in the 1890s. Banks failed in the Panic of 1837. Half of the banks in the country failed. Farmers couldn't get money just to borrow enough to get seed, and so they either became pioneers on the river first or later on the plains. And a great, huge number of the mythical pioneers on these plains started a generation before on this route. But it becomes a Rosetta Stone to understand it because we were a very unstable and economically unsophisticated developing country. But what allowed us to overtake the rest of the world? Free energy. This is before we became addicted to fossil fuels. Free energy. The Ohio, before all the dams and everything were put on, flows at 8 miles an hour, naturally. Mississippi, 12 miles an hour, naturally. You could take this route down, sell your products for export, and your energy costs were zero. From here, it was most of these products, particularly sugarcane, were sailed to the West Indies and participated in the rum trade. Or cotton was king. Cotton was the largest product in the world. It drove the Industrial Revolution to Leicester and Liverpool in England, where it was spun into fabric and so forth, and then redistributed through the world. In 1837, the United States Senate did a study trying to study how much money we should pour into the improvement along the rivers. We discovered that, or researched and found that, to take a ton of goods from Pittsburgh to New Orleans cost $3 per ton, because you had free energy, and also when you got down to New Orleans, these were one-way boats. You took the boat apart and sold it as lumber, and they built the cities out of this. First schoolhouse in Cincinnati, for instance, was built from bargeboard. $3 to here per ton, $5 to Barbados, $7 to get it to England. Because remember, drift, free energy, sail, free energy. Sailing was so efficient that the great clipper ship era continued to send product all over the world, but particularly to Great Britain and France, even after steamships had come in the 1870s. $3 to Barbados, $3 to New Orleans, $5 to Barbados, $7 to Great Britain. The same per ton. The same Senate report concluded that to get 100 miles across the muddy toll roads of Pennsylvania with horses and a wagon, 100 miles cost $30 per ton. So the rivers were the perfect solution, an accidental, almost inadvertent solution for developing America. And I just felt, and it's not a speculation, it's not a theory of mine. This is what happened. This created America. This huge export economy that, in the space of 3/4 of a century, dominated the world. So, periodically going through, mental health issues and whatnot, instead of taking the covered wagon across the plains this time, I decided I'd build a flatboat. I went to Tennessee, found a guy who helped me build a flatboat, built a flatboat, hauled it up to Pittsburgh, and sailed Jacob Yoder's old route down to New Orleans, and that was my book. That is my book. A lot of misadventures and everything. And I'll tell you that the biggest issue we faced on the river and we'll pause for questions afterwards, was fear. You know, my own brother said, I mean, I had no nautical experience. I paddled my canoe across Cream Hill Lake up in Cornwall, Connecticut. And you're gonna die. You don't know how to tie knots. All along the river, because so many families have lost family members to tugboat accidents and flooding. Even as late as the 2011 floods, over 400 Americans were killed flooding on the Ohio and Mississippi. Fear. You meet people along the river and they don't ever go near the river. They fear that river. And, oh, well, I wouldn't go down past the confluence of the Wabash today, the fellow said. Wabash, it's the Ohio, not far from Paducah, Kentucky. I wouldn't go down there today. There's been heavy rains in Indianapolis for the past week. And there's a whirlpool that forms at the confluence of the Wabash and the Ohio, and it's a good thing actually for you, because as you start spinning around in that whirlpool, the concentric forces are so large that you'll be passed out before the boat capsizes. But you better warn your family, because once the boat capsizes, you're going to be dragged along the bottom so violently and for so long, when your body comes up, you won't even have your underwear on. And this wasn't something that was said to me by some colorful river rat along it. You can't go there. You cannot do this. And as a result, you see, because of the fear of the river, you see no pleasure boats. I saw 4 pleasure boats in 1,000 miles of Mississippi, because people are afraid of that river. There's a whole bunch of other fears they have. You'll run out of gas and be run over by tugboat or barges and all this. So fear, what the book is about and what I became was the editor of fear. I had to edit between poor advice and extremist advice and what I knew myself I could do on the river. And I'll just tell you one last story, and then we'll get into the video and the pictures. And we will leave time for questioning. So if any of you have traveled in this area along southern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Illinois and everything, you know that it's really a part of the South. You get down towards Cincinnati or south of Terre Haute in Indiana, and the outlook is very southern. The accent is very southern. If you want to just do a rough judgment on, you know, what the nature of the people is like in this area, you count the Trump signs, you know, on the lawn. You know. So we got down there into southern Ohio and southern Indiana, and it was a very romantic journey. It was a very beautiful trip. We parked swinging from a tree at night, or we park at a town landing, usually very remote areas, small towns. And these deputy sheriffs would come down, you know, and they'd sit and have a few beers on the boat. Word got around that there was an interesting wooden boat down there, and the deputy sheriffs would come down, and we just learned to wait till they got to the subject. You know. All right, now what are you guys doing? What are you doing for weapons? You know? And we go, well, we've been on the river for 6 weeks now. We're fine. I mean, you know, they go. The look of consternation and concern for us. The deputy sheriff from southern Ohio said, "You mean y'all's traveling down this river and you have no weapons?" And I'd say, no, we don't think, we're fine. We don't need it. But why do you think we need weapons? Well, you got Cincinnati, Paducah, Louisville all along your route, and you're going to park there because you're going to have to shop and get some food and some gas and whatever. And them kids from them inner cities, okay, that's kind of a code word. Them kids from them inner cities is going to come roaring down the streets, kill you guys, and burn your boat. You need weapons. And one guy, even when we said, yeah, we're all right. You know, look, I'll go back to my house. I got a couple extra Glocks. I'll leave them for you. You know. And of course, we got down the river and we got to Louisville and Paducah and whatever. And the kids could not have been nicer. They came down from the projects and, hey, you want us to run for water for you? We'll sell you some fish, you know. If you don't want to buy fish, we'll sell you some pot, you know. Whatever you want, you know. They couldn't have been nicer. And then we got, so I had to edit out that fear. And then we got down to Baton Rouge, and 3 or 4 days from reaching New Orleans. And Baton Rouge, the river kind of divides the town. There's an old town, wealthy area on one side of the river, and then the inner city, Baton Rouge. And the kids came down, you know, the next morning, and they collect bottles and stuff on there's a beautiful gravel bar along the Mississippi there. Kids come down and collect bottles so they can make some money. They catch a lot of fish, and they walk up to the nearest highway and sell fish to the cars coming by and everything. People rely on it. You know, a lot of people, hey, I hope the kids have some fish tonight, so they take it home. So these kids come on, there were 4 of them, and they were really great. And they were from, you know, the ghetto in Baton Rouge. They said, well, go get your fish. We got a really good place right down here on the point. You want fish tonight? I said, yeah, we haven't been shopping. Get us some fish. Come on back. And when you come back, we'll cook it all up together and have a nice visit, you know. And these kids were just fun. They were funny. They were wonderful. They were sweet. And after dinner, you know, this black kid from Baton Rouge goes, say, Captain Buck, what are you doing for fajitas? And I said, you know, I'm this white guy from up north, you know, what do I know? Well, we found it pretty warm down here in the Mississippi. We don't think we need heaters yet. The kid is just like Chris Rock. You know, you are the dumbest white guy I've ever met. And I said, well, I just don't think we need, I mean, you know, we're doing fine. We're almost to New Orleans. And he goes, ammunition, man, protection. I said, well, I don't think we need it. He goes, you're still the dumbest white guy I've ever met. And then I said, well, why do you think we need weapons? And he says, 50 miles downriver from here, you're going to enter Cajun country. And them Cajuns is going to come storming out of the swamp, kill you, and burn your boat. And it was just fascinating. Just downriver from there, the beautiful stretches where the sandbars stretch off to the horizon, as beautiful as, you know, Cape Cod National Seashore. And there are thousands and thousands of American white pelicans rise at once. It's just beautiful. And it made me contemplative and romantic. And I realized, well, this is another thing I've learned on the trip. Don't listen to the words. The words don't really say what. It wasn't about guns. That's just the outcome. That's just the solution that America thinks it's come up with, or the manufacturers have, or the people in Congress, whatever. We'll go there. But the real issue was fear. Here you have these 2 diametrically opposed groups. Black kids in Baton Rouge and the white guys up in little towns along the Ohio, and they have no reason to fear each other, and they fear each other. And that's the kind of thing I learned along on the trip. So what we're going to do now, so we're going to go to a video and then some pictures, which I'll try and get through quickly. But if we just do the video first.
I did the book basically for 2 reasons.
okay?
Yeah.
First of all,
We had enough
all
time,
of us
yeah.
grew up
Yep.
with
That's
the conception of history that the pioneer period was horses, mules, oxen, and covered wagons crossing the plain. So it was a surprise to me when I learned that, in fact, the frontier really began 50 years before, right after the Revolution. And it was down the wash watersheds of big inland rivers, the Ohio, Mississippi, and the tributaries. This fundamentally changed my conception of history, and so I wanted to build a flatboat and go those 2,000 miles from Elizabeth, PA to New Orleans and use the trip as kind of a vessel that I could tell the history through. What surprised me the most was the diversity of the populations, the multiculturalism of America, that people think we just invented that and we're just talking about it nowadays. Certain people on the far right, they just wanted to define America as a bunch of white guys, who were being invaded. No, it was never just a bunch of white guys. It was a very big mix of native peoples and Europeans and so forth. It was also very surprising how quickly and complicated the economy burst on the rivers. The speed with which the American economy expanded during this period was extraordinary.
It's a feeling of great accomplishment because I started this trip not much of a boater.
New airplanes, I was less pilot habits from a young age. And I knew horses and mules because I'd grown up with them. But I've never been a boatman, and so I had to teach myself a whole new set of skills. That was a very great lesson because I made a mistake of a lot of issues, so I relied on the advice of people who said they knew what they were doing. And they didn't. We'd be going down the river, and all these people who were supposedly experts, they would tell us, you can't go through those whirlpools on the river because your boat will crash and you'll be sucked on the bottom and you won't even have your underwear on when you come back up. You better carry your family. Things like that simply were not accurate. So that was the biggest thing I learned, which was that the skills I needed to get down the river resided within me already, but I had to draw them out by experience. That is significant because the flatboat experience, which created the American global economy, was undertaken by untrained, uneducated farmers. And they had to teach themselves going down the river. And they were completely inexperienced. They were teaching themselves to conquer fear.
Alright, going into the dock at Audubon Park in New Orleans. What a fitting ending to this glorious trip.
Okay, so we're gonna go to the next picture. Let's see if we can.
I did the book basically for two reasons. First of all,
Picture.
all of us grew up
The
with
pi-
the conception of
the
history
picture
that
of the-
pioneer
Photographs.
was horses, mules, oxen.
There we go. Yeah.
That's what you're.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the flatboat Patience. This is the first day we floated it on the Cumberland River just to test it out. I camped on it for a few days just to get used to being on it. And it was 40 feet by 14 feet, which was typical dimensions of the early flatboat era. Later on, the flatboats got huge, up to 100 tons, 100 feet, carrying 100 tons. This is the creation of America right here, the flat bottom. I'm probably not telling all of you something you don't know, but the flat bottom boat, which distributes the weight across a very broad surface, it displaces a much smaller amount of water than if you had a V-hull where the water is coming all the way up to the freeboard. So a V-hull, like an old keelboat or something, is going to draw between 3 and 9 feet, depending on how large it is and how low the load. I just placed this in the Cumberland and used my, at 8 tons, weighed 8 tons. Empty, I was drawing 18 inches. Once I got all my crew and equipment and everything else on board, we were 10 tons, and we were drawing 20 inches. That's what made the American economy right there, because you could float that down the river through the huge tree snags, over rocks, over shoals and whatever, and it would usually just glide right over it, and if it caught a little, it was massive enough and flat to just pass on down the river, whereas a V-hull is going to get stuck. So this is the flatboat I built out of poplar in Tennessee. green cobbler. And I'll just point this out here. A lady the other night, I think it was in Wichita, asked me, is that where the air conditioning went? And I said, no, it's supposed to be a chicken coop. And we'll go on to the next picture. I think all you have to do is...
That it?
Yeah, there we go. So
Okay.
this is the flatboat patients being dropped down the town landing in Elizabeth, PA, near Pittsburgh. And we went to Elizabeth, PA because it was one of the original and largest flatboating towns where they made flatboats in the 19th century. Next one. And this is Elizabeth. One of the joys of the trip was there's just unending national forests and some industrial areas and everything along the Ohio, and it's just an extraordinarily beautiful trip. But the gem, the surprise, there's the flatboat patients at the bottom at the town wharf now, of the Ohio River is town after town after town. Lawrenceburg, Indiana, Audubon, Indiana, just Marietta, Ohio, Natchez, Vicksburg, just town after town has been preserved in this state, and you just would come around the bend and there would be this beautiful town looking kind of like a Fabergé egg. And the next one, yeah. Okay, so these, I read a lot about, there's a lot in the book about the death of coal and what that means for the Ohio River Valley especially. But it was still 30% of our GDP is carried out for export down the Ohio and Mississippi. And a huge amount of that is coal. Coal is declining, it's slowly dying for the reasons that we all know about. But one thing that I discovered on the trip, which was very significant, an empty barge draws, a tugboat captain told me this, an empty barge draws 3 feet. A full barge draws 9 feet. This is all an unloading operation for the electrical utility plant up there. When the river traffic got busy, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a second, when the river traffic got busy, I learned I could just hug these mooring cells along the river like this, and I'm only drawing 20 inches. That's drawing 3 feet, that's 9 feet. I was in a perfectly safe zone, well away from the traffic, and if there was a barge there, I knew what my depth was. We didn't have a fathometer, but I really didn't need one. That told me what I had. This is just a nice picture of what it looked like. You can see some of the barge traffic behind me. It just kind of gives you a sense of what it looked like going down the river. There's 20 locks and dams on the Ohio, and I had to learn how to use the locks. It was a little bit scary at first. You had to talk to the lockmaster and this and that. My aviation skills helped a lot because I knew it was similar kind of communication. But the scariest thing about it is we get in a lock, and the tugboats, these big 9,000 horsepower tugboats, are pushing 40 or 50 barges at once. And every time they go through a lock, they can only get 3 or 4 of them in there, so they have to break up their whole load and take them through, 3 or 4 at a time. And you can take a big barge tow all day to get through the locks. So I'm down there, and the lockmaster says, just pull down to the last bollard by the exit gates there, and park and tie up, and just sit tight. We got a little more traffic coming in. Next thing I know, there's a barge, and it's drifting towards me, and they deliberately pushed it a little fast. And what I didn't know is they actually have a line tied to it, and they know exactly how long that line is, where they want it to stop, which is at 4 inches from me. And all these stories, you're gonna die, you're gonna get squeezed against the walls of the locks, you're gonna die, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going, whew, and so I called the lockmaster. I said, this barge is still moving towards us, and the captain of the tug came on. Don't worry, I ain't gonna hit you. And so it was a lot to learn the next one. Yeah, you had to learn that. This is just a nice picture of how beautiful it is. I told you that great long stretches of national forest. There's beautiful stone bluffs up in the hill. This is just a typical night. We found a dock, a private dock, that the guy said, oh yeah, you can have a good time there. And I think we took our chairs out because we were planning on having dinner, but out on the dock. But it just shows you how scenic and beautiful the trip was. All right, well, we're gonna die. I died 100 deaths already, if I were listening to people, because we run out of gas. There's no marinas on the Mississippi and only a few on the Ohio. These are rivers run for commercial traffic, not pleasure traffic. So the solution was simple. I just bought a electric bike, a bunch of gas cans. I could carry, it was a cargo model of the electric bike, and I could carry 36 gallons. And then we just go into town. And it was great because we get somewhere at night and we realize we needed fuel, and we tie up on the levee, and then spooky, beautiful, cricket screeching country of Mississippi or Louisiana, and we push up over the levee, push that electric bike up over the levee. Sometimes there's a secondary levee for extra protection, and then push through a little screen of woods, and then you get out and you find a road, and you just look off there on the horizon, just look for an aura of orange and yellow light just out there, and you steer for that. And what it was, every one of these towns down there, that was the local Dairy Queen. And all the kids parked there, and we just go for the Dairy Queen, and there'd be tons of gas there, and the kids just loved it. They all had pickup trucks and said, "You're not going to ride that thing all the way back to your boat. I'm going to put it in a pickup, and we'll take you back down there." And so the trip became searching for gas and using the Dairy Queen as my GPS. Became a very romantic thing and a way to meet people and stuff like that. This is just another beautiful picture. You saw it in that. This is the West Virginia mountains, and you can see how the river curves through the gorges and just endless national forests along the Ohio, and it makes you, that's all right, stay there. It makes you respect the fact that America has devoted so much to protecting forested space. All right, so learning how to negotiate around all the tugboat captains and everything was quite a trip. And we first got on the river, and the captains, you'd hear the captains talking on the radio, and they go like, "I don't know, there's some kind of wooden pirate boat or something thing down there. And he seems to know what he's doing. I'm just telling you guys, there's some kind of, I don't know who they are coming down the river." Because staying out of their way is job number one. And if you get in their way, they can't stop. They can't stop, 130 million tons of coal. They literally can't. So in this situation, I had actually another barge over here with coal, and these two barges. There's 1, 2, and this guy talked to us. Anyway, as we got down the river, the guys, they learned. They all talked to each other. There's a culture along the river, and they learned it. We seemed to know what we were doing. We certainly stayed out of their way, and then well, there's a flatboat Patients right up there. I looked at their Facebook page today. It's pretty good. And in this case, I had 3 barges all around me, and the guy in the middle hailed me, and he said, "Hey, flatboat Patients, you just stay right there, right on that barge where I'm on mine where you are. And I'll talk to all the other boats and keep them out of your way." And I said, "Well, thank you, Captain." He goes, "Well, don't thank me. If you talk to them, they're not going to listen to you." So I have to talk to them. Okay, excellent. So that was sort of what I learned. This just gives you an example. These rusty cylindrical shapes are what they call mooring cells. It's actually a very heavy corrugated steel, and inside it is rock. That's what's needed to hold in currents a heavy load of coal. And I learned, and the mooring cells are all marked really well on the maps, and I learned to use them as a navigation. This just gives you a sense of what it was like. This is the Ohio River. I think we're approaching Gallipolis, Ohio here. And one of my friends, one of my guys on the boat went up to the bridge, photographed it, and hitchhiked down, and we met him downriver. Because he just wanted to show what it was like being on the Ohio River with a boat that really was quite substantial, but it looks miniaturized when you see it in the context of the whole river. Okay, we got a lot of light in here, but you get the idea. This is a nighttime scene. There's the flatboat patios to the left. And what you have here in Felicity, Ohio, is Fat Boys Floating Restaurant and Bar. And it was one of the great finds of the trip. People don't do much recreational boating on the river because of the barge traffic, and they're afraid to go there. But this is a parking lot. It's right outside Felicity, Ohio, and it's, you know, let's go to Fat Boys for dinner, and it's just a floating dock with a restaurant in it. And I saw it on the map, so I said, let's go over there. We might be able to get a good lunch, and we did get a good lunch. They were serving sloppy joes and all the fixings. And then I was about to cast off again, and the owner of the place said, "Oh, I wish you wouldn't go. I'm kind of anxious to get downriver and make some more miles today." He said, "I wish you wouldn't go. I'll tell you what, if you stay for dinner, I'll give you free gin and tonics." And that was about 6 hours ago, and you see, we stayed. So, this just gives you a good idea of what it looked like. We had a tarp over our top of our head called a bivvy to keep the sun off us. It was very important along the river to always know exactly where you are. There are mile markers along the shore that you can find with your binoculars. There are other prominent landmarks along the way, including bridges. But if a tugboat captain is around the bend and he hears there's traffic ahead or he sees traffic on his radar, and he hails you and says, "Where are you?" you better be able to say, "We're at mile 386. Otherwise, they can report you as a hazard of navigation. You must know where you are by Coast Guard regulations. And we saw a few examples of people who weren't. It was a real mess. Anyway, this is Cynthia Lee and Deb Satterfield. They were two of my crew members. They were very good navigators. You can see Cynthia looking off to try and figure out exactly where we are. And the rule was I would drive the boat and they would navigate, or they would drive the boat and I would navigate. We divided those roles because it was so important. Somebody had to be able to steer away from the tug traffic, and somebody had to know exactly where we were at all times. That's just another pretty thing. That's along the Mississippi. That's near Tiptonville, Tennessee. That's this riprap. The rock comes down very steeply. These levees might go up 60 or 70 feet to protect. After the 27 floods, a very elaborate system of levees were put in all along the river, and we parked there at night. It was very romantic and nice, but if the storm came up and you had to go out and adjust your lines so the boat didn't drift, the riprap is quarried. It's a heavy rock, and it's quarried deliberately with sharp edges because sharp edges repel water better than rounded edges. And I really appreciated that when I went out to adjust my lines one night in the middle of a thunderstorm and got knocked down by a tree branch and fell in that riprap and broke my ribs. So there were hazards to the journey too. This just gives you another example of the kind of traffic issues we faced. All right, I've got 10 knots of current behind me. This is on the Mississippi. I'm coming down. You can see, if you can see from there, there's a tan thing here, tan thing there. Low water. The tugboat captains know exactly how they're going to get through the low water. They're all talking to each other and staying out of each other's way and staying in the channel. And I had to figure out, how do I negotiate this situation? Because I can't stop. I got a lot of current behind me. And the solution that I came up with is I would pull right up to the stern of that big tug and just stay in his wake, really close, 40 yards off I'd stay, and just follow him through because I knew he was going to get through, and I'm in his wake. in his water. And, you know, the captains would come back and look at me, you know, and they go, you know, I said, oh, I'm gonna stay back 40 yards to make sure I don't hit you. And he goes, you know, if you hit me, it ain't gonna hurt me. This is then you get below Baton Rouge, and the Mississippi River is an official sea lane. 300 miles up the river is an official sea lane, and you have 900-foot Panamax boats. Panamax means they can fit through the Panama Canal. You have 7 or 8 of these sharing the channel with you at any one time. And that was, you know. Oh, and here we are, and this is by George Caleb Bingham. He was sort of the famous painter of the flatboat era. This is called the Jolly Boatman. It's a famous painting. I believe it's in the National Gallery now, or maybe it's the Corcoran Gallery. And there's another one in the St. Louis Museum of Art. And but just so you know, you've learned a lot of history tonight, but I can tell you this: it's a lot more sophisticated at the time than you thought, because look at that air conditioning unit. So I'm going to go to questions now. And then, well, we're a little over, but whatever. Are we all right on time?
Yeah, and then we'll go over to the more questions over there, if that's all right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll try and do abbreviated
Couple.
questions. But if anybody has a question, I'll answer a couple of them. Please, in the back.
Next to your helm, there's an elevated board.
Yeah.
I couldn't quite figure out why you had that.
You mean where we were sitting?
Yes.
We had a console there.
Yeah, there's a console, but one side of it is low.
Oh, just because the guy that built the boat, it's all in the book, but the guy that built the boat just said, I don't feel like taking it off. Let's just leave it. It was that simple, you know. Oh, please.
What was your speed underway, and what would it have been if you had just floated down the river?
Well, the reason we had to have a motor is that it's illegal to drift on the river now because of the barge traffic, because you could drift into them. But second of all, there's 20 locks and dams on the Ohio and innumerable wing dams and all kinds of other things built on the Mississippi to control the flow and make it better for the tugboats. And so, in between those locks and dams, it's actually a lake. Okay? They call it a controlled pool. They're always releasing water or holding water to make the conditions the most favorable they want for the tugboat traffic. And then it could be a 40 or 50 mile lake in between the dams. So that's why we had the motor, because we had to maneuver, and our speed was about 5 knots, so 6 or 7 miles an hour. On the Mississippi, our speed was anywhere from 10 to 20, depending on the currents. Or, shit, I'm going to get out of this guy's way. If they were coming at you from behind, it was downcoming traffic. It was relatively easy to stay ahead of them because he had a heavy load, of course. But if they're coming upriver, especially around a bend, it was very difficult to get around them. And at one point, I don't spoil the book, but at one point,
What was it, an outboard?
it was an outboard. It was just 115 mercury, pushing 10 tons, which was pretty good. And we were relatively maneuverable. We did well with it.
Did you have a rudder, or was the motor?
Just the motor, and then we did have big oars, and that was, it's a big thing. When we got down to the bottom of the Ohio, the Mississippi is a much more dangerous river. We realized we needed a backup motor for a main motor. Conked out, we needed, and then we put a little 35 horse on it with an extra transom that we built on the spot, and then tested it on the Ohio on a day when the currents were good, and we could maneuver fine with it. So, but that was just for protection. We only used it once in an emergency we had. But I'm not going to spoil the boat for you. Please.
Where is the boat now?
The boat. She wants to know where is the boat now. The boat is in a little tiny town in Illinois. It's a long story, but I ended up having to sell it back to the flatboat builder. And he gave it away to a guy who uses it at a little static museum, as a static display museum, talking about the flatboat era, that kind of thing. So, all right, one more question, then we're,
Sure.
please.
I grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia.
Morgantown, we went right through, yeah.
Yes, you mentioned that in the book.
Yeah,
I used to watch paddle boats on the river, on the Monongahela River. Did you see any of those?
we saw them, they're collector's items now. In other words, I think they were either steam or diesel driven, and they used the paddle. What was it behind? The paddle was behind?
Yes,
Right.
yeah.
They used paddle boats right up until 50s or 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Just as switch boats across the river, they used them as ferries.
Ferries,
You could carry boats across. And I actually, when I got to Cave in Rock, Illinois, I actually there's still a ferry there. I took it across the Ohio and went and visited the Amish on the other side of the river. But those paddle boats were active pretty late in the game. And now, they're kind of not on the river anymore, except guys restore them, and it's kind of a collector's item, things like that. Because so many bridges have been built. The
Yeah.
bridges have kind of replaced all the ferries that went across. So I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm going to sign some books.